I want to jump right in to talk about media bias. I happen to be a member of the media, and so I really hope that you didn't bring any rotten produce to throw or anything like that, but I'm good media, friendly media, and not the kind that you see on television that's kind of giving you lies and misinformation. But I want to jump right in, and we're going to talk today about media bias, what it is, what it looks like, understanding why the media is biased and how they see themselves as unbiased. And then at the end, we're going to talk about the most important thing, which is what you can do about media bias, how you can respond. And then, of course, we'll take some questions and answers. Well, I want to start with talking to you about the abortion position and the views of the media, because I think that really is very helpful in understanding why, when you're watching your nightly news, why when you're reading your newspaper, listening to the radio news on radio, maybe with NPR or some other station, when you tune into any of those networks, why are they biased? Well, let's go back to 1981, because I want to talk to you about some polls that they've actually done of journalists. Usually polling data is of people like you and me, but these were polls of journalists and of people in the media. In 1981, there was a New York Times poll that came out, and they said 90% of people in the media, your reporters, your journalists, agree that a woman, quote, has a right to decide for herself when to have an abortion. 79% of your reporters, your media journalists, and network anchors agree very strongly with that position that a woman should have a right to an abortion. 90% agree, 79% agree very strongly. So this is the mindset of the media that you're dealing with. But that's not just one poll. 1985, Los Angeles Times surveyed members of the media. 82% of reporters and editors in that poll favored allowing a woman to have an abortion. 1988, another New York Times poll, they surveyed 151 journalists, and in this case, financial reporters. You think maybe they might be less biased somehow because they're involved in financial reporting. But no, 86% of all those reporters said that they favored legalized abortion. A 1992 poll, a Media Studies Journal poll, more than half of journalists, 51%, said abortion should be legal under any circumstances. 51%. Only 4% of those people in that poll thought abortion should be illegal under any circumstance. 1995, two media researchers, Stanley Rothman and Amy Black, conducted a poll of the news media elite, the top people in the news reporting business. Nearly everybody they surveyed, 97% in that survey, agreed that a woman has a right to have an abortion. 5 out of 6, in that one, 84%, agreed very strongly that a woman should have a right to an abortion. So this is what you're dealing with. You're dealing with a media where their worldview, their mindset, their attitude on abortion is not only for abortion, not only keeping it legal, they're very, very strongly pro-abortion. In fact, a lot of times you're seeing media reporters being hired by campaigns. The Obama administration, for example, has hired people out of the media because, frankly, they're one of them. They agree so strongly together on the issue of abortion. But what do we think? We disagree with that. We have a different view as viewers of the media. A Pew Research Center poll that came out just this last October said that they were looking at people and how they looked at the media and whether there was bias. This poll found this: by a margin of 70 to 9%, Americans said they think most journalists are biased. In fact, they said by that 70 to 9% margin that they thought 70% of journalists wanted Obama to win. 8% said they don't think journalists favor any candidate, and 13% said they didn't know which candidate journalists that they watched on television would support. But 70% of Americans in that survey thought that the members of the media that they watch wanted Obama to win. So we understand that there's bias in the media. By comparison, look at the 2004 election. In that survey, the same Pew Research Center poll in 2004, 50% of voters in that election said they thought journalists wanted John Kerry to win. Only 22% said they thought members of the media wanted George Bush to win. So in two separate polls, we as viewers, as consumers of the news, are realizing that there's a bias, especially when it comes to elections. In October of 2000, we saw the same thing, a 47% to 13% margin. Americans thought that Al Gore is the one that most members of the media wanted to win. So we're kind of seeing that. You and I, other people in America, are understanding there's a bias there when it comes to the media. There was another poll that came out that talked about what we think, and I wanted to share this with you as well. January of 2008, Sacred Heart University took a poll, and they looked at the percentage of Americans in terms of which network they trusted the most. And I found these results very interesting. They broke down all of the main networks to see which one was the one they thought was the least biased. In terms of television networks, CNN came out first. Now keep in mind, this is a poll of all Americans, not just pro-lifers or conservatives. CNN came out to be number one, 14.6% said that they thought CNN was the least biased. NBC came in at 11%, ABC 7%, their local news channel, whichever network that might be, 6.9%, and CBS News 6.8%. Just 19.6% of people, though, in this survey, only 20% of everybody polled in this survey said that they could believe the news reporting that they're seeing on television. 80% of people say they don't really think they can believe every news story they see on television. So we get it. We understand it. That 20% figure who say they think they can believe what they see on their television, that's down from 27% in 2003. So the news media is so biased and so wrong in what it's reporting, they've lost 7% of what was already a very low number in that poll. I wanted to show you this story here. Even though we understand there's news bias, the media doesn't understand it. They don't think they're biased at all. Former USA Today editor says media bias is, quote, a myth. Former USA Today editor Kenneth Paulson attacked what he called the myth of media bias in an article, and this is from June of 2010, not too long ago. He described the claims of media bias as untrue, but of course he didn't cite any evidence as to what he thought was untrue about this media bias we're all concerned about. He said, this is what he had to say. Despite the perception of news media bias, the truth is most traditional news organizations, primarily newspapers, their websites, local TV and radio, adhere to an in-house code of ethics and keep politicians at arm's length. Yeah, right. So that's what they think. The writer here of this blog, Tim Graham, who's a good pro-life person, he's on the left, the USA Today editor's on the right. He says, this sounds as if the USA Today editor is writing for a naive sixth grader. Obviously, anybody above the sixth grade level is going to realize there's a lot of bias in the media. So it's really silly to just claim that there's not. The credibility in the news divisions that are out there and the bias has gotten worse. They don't think they're biased. We realize that, but that downward slide continues. In fact, a Pew survey released in February, just a couple of months ago, found 67% of Americans think that there's a great deal, a fair amount, or at least some political bias in the news media. Now, that's a record high, 67%. Currently, 37% of Americans said that there's a great deal of bias in news coverage, and 30% say there's only a fair amount of bias. Far fewer are saying not much bias at all or none or no bias at all, and only 10% of Americans think there's no bias right now in the media. The percentage saying that there's a great deal of bias has increased 6% from 31 to 37% since 2008. So the question then becomes, do people perceive a media bias? And if they do they think the media is biased one way or the other? Which direction do they think is biased? Well, Pew didn't ask that, but data indicates from their poll that about a half of Republicans, 49%, say there's a great deal of bias, and that's gone up to 57%. So on the right, Republicans say there's a bias. On the left, though, Democrats don't think there's quite as much of a bias. I wonder why. 32% of Democrats think that there's a news bias, and 35% of independents also believe that there's a news bias. So when it comes to what kind of bias is in the media and in the news, I think we recognize much more quickly that the news is slanted one way versus the other. Back in September, Gallup documented the public bias in terms of which kind it detected, and the majority of Americans said that they thought there was bias in the media. 47% of those who thought there was bias thought that the media bias was in the liberal direction. Only 13% said that they thought it was in a conservative direction. So clearly we're understanding what the bias is and which way it goes. Some more information from Gallup, which I think is very instructive. 74% of Republicans who agree with the Tea Party movement say there is a great deal of bias, which of course is twice the percentage of those who do not identify with the Tea Party movement. And liberal Democrats, only a third of them say there's any news bias. So I think we're realizing what's going on here, and those numbers certainly bear that out. Now, talking about some of these news sources, I wanted to share another poll that came out that talked about, again, the cable news networks. We talked about the mainstream ones, but if you include the cable news networks, what do Americans think? Where are they at on which one's biased and which one's not? There's a January poll that just came out from a Democratic polling firm, so keep this in mind. This is a polling firm that's run by Democrats asking about bias in the media. They wanted to ask about which is the most trusted TV news source. Fox News, 34% of Americans in this poll said that it was the most trusted source. So even with a Democratic polling firm, they realized that Fox News is better than some of the more liberal media outlets. 17% said PBS was their most trusted source. 12% said CNN, 11% for ABC, 8% for CBS, 5% for MSNBC, which is a terrible network. I don't know why anybody watches that. And 4% for Comedy Central, which is kind of a joke, and NBC. So if you heard that down at the bottom, Comedy Central, 4% of Americans say it is the most trusted source. But look who it was tied with, NBC, 4% of Americans. So NBC is only as trustworthy as the Comedy Network with comedians on late night television. 68%, this isn't surprising, of Republicans picked Fox as their most trusted news source, Fox News, and nobody else even came in double digits. So for the conservative side, I guess the more pro-life side of the equation, Fox News is definitely the number one outlet out there. Democrats, this is interesting. What do Democrats believe? PBS, not surprisingly. 21% of Democrats felt that it was the most trusted news source. ABC News at 19% and CNN at 17% for Democrats in that survey. Despite having a reputation for appealing to the left, as we talked about, MSNBC, actually among Democrats itself, polls in 6th place for the most trusted news source, which kind of makes you understand why they got rid of Keith Olbermann, who frequently talks about pro-lifers in a negative way. In fact, Keith Olbermann, this is how biased MSNBC is. He used to have, and maybe you saw this or heard about this, the most hated person in the world, the worst person in the world award. So every night in his program, he would give that award out. I don't recall any pro-abortion person getting that award, but pro-lifers, many pro-lifers have received that award from him, which just goes to show just really where the bias is in terms of his program. I want to talk about a story that I think is funny and just kind of share a little anecdote with you to show you the kind of the way the media approaches things. You may remember during the election, President Bush, when he was running for re-election, you may remember this joke. He was out on the water with Pope John Paul II at the time, and they're fishing in this boat, and they're out on this water, they're out on the lake, and what happens is the boat begins to tip over, and the water just gets choppy where they're at. The boat begins to move, and the Pope falls out of the boat. And of course, the president is thinking, I've got to do something about this. I need to jump in the water. I need to do something important here and help save the Pope from drowning. And so he jumps in the water, but instead of swimming, he's walking on the water. And the Pope begins to, his garments are taking him out, and he's sailing away and getting away from the boat. And President Bush is thinking, I've got to really hurry. So he's walking on the water to go save the Pope, believe it or not, gets the Pope back in the boat, and reporters happen to be there. And they witness this story, and they write in the newspapers the next day, George Bush can't swim. And that's really just kind of an anecdote to let you know that's where the media is at. There's this great thing that's happening. There's this wonderful thing that we're doing as pro-lifers, and they're going to report something that's completely contradictory or looking at it in a different way that's different. And that's one of the problems we see is they don't realize that they're biased. They don't understand what we're seeing. I wanted to share with you this. We understand there's bias and we've criticized them, but what do they think about themselves? And kind of going off of this article about the USA Today editor saying that he thinks bias is a myth. There was a 2005 poll conducted by the Annenberg Public Policy Center. 95% of journalists, newspaper reporters that were surveyed, believe that the ethical practices that they use in their reporting and work is very good. 95% think that they're doing a good job. 32% say they're doing a very good job of reporting the news, and the rest said that they thought they were doing a good or somewhat good job. But 32% and 95% of all reporters think they're getting it right. Most journalists in this poll also said that they thought news organizations get their facts straight. 86% of all journalists think that their news organization that they work for gets it right. Now, I know you've read the Oregonian newspaper. I know you've seen on television these news reports. I'm pretty sure 86% of the time they're not getting it right, but 86% say that their news organization gets it right when they report the news. In fact, 74%, and I've had, as I'm sure you have, a lot of experience with this, 74% of journalists in this survey believe that they try to fix their mistakes rather than covering them up, and they try to fix them very quickly. Now, if you've probably seen a lot of mistakes and a lot of problems and bias in the news, you've probably contacted them. I don't think they correct that very quickly. I don't know about you, but that's my opinion. Rich Noyes of the Media Research Center is from a group that's a conservative organization that analyzes the media. And he took a look at, and I wanted to share this with you, stories about abortion. And he wanted to do a survey to find out when they're covering abortion, how often do they mention that? Is it something that they talk about? And he looked at the period of January 2007 to June of 2008, which covered part of an election year, and he found that television news networks barely mention the issue of abortion at all in the fight that we're fighting. In fact, he surveyed 1,289 network news stories and found that less than 0.5% ever covered the issue of abortion. And when they did cover the issue of abortion, here's what he found. He found that only 22% of the time was there even a pro-life person representing a pro-life organization talking about our side of the abortion debate. So here, out of thousands of news stories, they rarely cover our topics, and when they do, only 22% of the time, not even a quarter of the time, is our side represented. He found that in those other occasions, 78% of the time, they had somebody from one of the prominent pro-abortion groups, whether that's Planned Parenthood or NARAL or NOW or somebody like that, represented, and we only got billing less than a quarter of the time. It's not surprising, though, because these organizations have a great relationship with the media. In fact, you may have heard just a couple of years ago, NOW, the National Organization of Women, had an annual gala in which they gave Katie Couric their #1 award, their top award at their annual gala. And of course, Katie Couric is a liberal journalist who has called pro-lifers repugnant, and she's marched with abortion advocates in Washington, D.C. In fact, there was a big to-do. I'm going to see if I can find this on Life News while I talk about it. There was a big to-do not long ago where I believe it was Whoopi Goldberg on The View was talking with Katie Couric. See if this is it. Okay, here's the one where she's talking about us being repugnant. CBS News, Katie Couric labels pro-lifers' view on abortion repugnant. That was in October of 2006. Not too long ago, a couple of years ago, Katie Couric was talking with Whoopi Goldberg on The View program, and Whoopi basically let it slip that she had participated in a pro-abortion march in Washington, and Whoopi was talking about her own pro-abortion views. Whoopi Goldberg is on the board of Planned Parenthood, has been for many years, and was talking about where she comes from as somebody who supports abortion. And she was talking to Katie and said, you know, you understand what I'm talking about. We've marched together. In which Katie responded, and I tried to look for the video and I couldn't find it preparing for this workshop. Katie basically responded saying, oh, no, I don't know what you're talking about. You know, this is news to me. I've never marched in any march. She really was downplaying this comment from Whoopi Goldberg that, oh, they've participated in this march together. So it's not surprising that you see this bias, because here's Katie Couric, one of the top news anchors in news business, out there marching along with the people at Planned Parenthood and NOW. So it's not surprising at all that we see this. We also see the coverage is biased just in terms of the actual content that we see. I don't know, a lot of times you may see in your newspaper during elections, the Associated Press, for example, will talk about where candidates stand on different issues. And they'll have, you know, such and such an issue, and then maybe a paragraph long blurb about, oh, you know, John Doe supports this or opposes that or what have you. I thought it was interesting that the Associated Press, bless you, in 2008, when they were talking about the presidential candidates, had all these paragraphs on all these different political issues. Well, they had one, of course, devoted to abortion. And they had one on Obama. And of course, we knew President Obama's record before he ran as president. We understood that he had voted pro-abortion. We knew in Illinois he had he had opposed a bill that was going to stop live birth abortions and protect unborn children, frankly, from infanticide if they happened to be born. And then, as Jill Stanek uncovered, they were being left to die. We knew he held up that bill in the legislature. We knew there was a lot of data, a lot of information. Well, this is how the Associated Press described President Obama's views back then during the campaign. They used used 3 words to sum up his entire record to that point: supports legal abortion. That's it. That's all you got on his record if that's all you did was read that one story about his abortion views during the campaign. 3 words: supports legal abortion. Nothing else about anything in terms of his funding, votes for funding Planned Parenthood, funding abortions with your taxpayer dollars. Nothing on that, 3 words. So that's certainly what you see. Let's talk about what we can do. I love talking about media bias, but I love even more talking about combating media bias. One of the things that I encourage you to do, frankly, is to stop watching, to stop buying. I am actually very encouraged, because I hope they'll find legitimate jobs elsewhere, that people are being unemployed in the media business. We want to reduce unemployment, but for goodness sakes, if we're going to have people looking for jobs, let's start with the people in the media who are giving us the story and not giving it to us straight. The interesting thing is we're seeing the media suffering, and I think really paying a price for the bias that we're seeing out there. The New York Times, these are some headlines that I just pasted into my notes here that I've seen in the last few months. New York Times posts a loss of 16% in terms of their ad revenue. NBC is cutting off people. The Washington Post has laid off half their staff in one of their divisions. 24 out of the 25 largest newspapers are experiencing record declines in subscribership and circulation because we're no longer subscribing to those liberal newspapers that are not printing the pro-life truth and printing it the right way. Get out of the mainstream media. Don't patronize them. There's no reason for you to be buying a copy of the Washington Post that's going to print an article on partial birth abortion and not tell you anything about it and basically include Planned Parenthood's talking points. We don't need to subsidize that, so I really encourage you to do that. And the great thing is, in this day and age with the internet and alternative media, we have lots of other alternatives. There are lots of avenues that you can look to get news. And one of the things that I do encourage you to do is to look to alternative news sources, not just to Life News, but many others. There are a lot of other good news sources that also happen to do some pro-life reporting. CNS News is a good one, One News Now. You go to some of the big blogs like Hot Air, Red State, or some of the big places out there that are reporting the truth. Go to those for your news. Look at the internet. Look at the Drudge Report. Look at things like that, where people are reporting the truth and getting accurate information out there. One of the things that we're still seeing a problem with is pro-life people, good pro-life people like you and me, will go to a mainstream media website because a lot of them are, Washington Post, New York Times, they're getting on the web, they're promoting their news that way. They'll promote one of their stories. And so we'll have, for example, front page news, President Obama hires a Planned Parenthood spokesman to represent him at the Department of Health and Human Services. When you see a story like that, don't just forward the New York Times version of it, which isn't going to have any, extensive information. Forward a version that comes from a pro-life source that has the facts, that gives you all the information and what's going on. And so don't feed into that mainstream misinformation, if you will. Forward those stories and be a part of that with the accurate news that's out there. We're seeing with Facebook, some of you may have come from the social media session that a couple of us just did. Facebook and Twitter and other places are a great way to share accurate news and information. When you see what's going on, use those to share, for example, Life News Stories, Oregon Right to Life, when it sends that information and it talks about maybe a vote in Congress that just happened. Don't share the mainstream media story. Share Oregon Right to Life's report, because they're going to give it to you straight on what's happened and what your elected officials have done in Washington or down in Salem. So share that information. One of the things that I want to encourage you to continue doing is letters to the editor. A lot of people have stopped doing letters to the editor. They feel like it just, they're not going to print it, or nobody's going to read it. Who reads that section anymore? I tell you now, actually more people than ever read letters to the editor, and here's why. You put together a letter to the editor, and then what happens is the newspaper website, say it's the Oregonian or anyone around the state, puts it online. And so you can go to some place, if I can type, like Google News. And if you do a search on news at Google News or Yahoo News or other places that index news, your letters to the editor frequently come up in Google News and in Yahoo News, because that letter is put on the Oregonian's website, for example, and then potentially millions of people can be reading it and exposed to your letter. So if I did a search at the top on, pro-life or whatever, those letters frequently come up. So continue writing those, continue being involved. You actually are reaching a lot more people now than maybe you ever have before, so don't stop doing that. One thing I encourage you to do is respond to mainstream news stories online. Let's go to the Washington Times, and unfortunately, a good pro-lifer, Chuck Colson, passed away. He's been very ill this last week, and he just passed away, in case you didn't see that. But I want to take you to the bottom. After you were to read that story, most websites nowadays contain areas where you can submit comments. And here are comments already. 13 people have commented on this news story about Chuck Colson passing away. It's a great way to get your views out there, because this one web story on Chuck Colson over at the LA Times, I mean, hundreds of thousands of people are going to read this actual story on their website. If you've commented, especially if it's on abortion and pro-life issues, and you've found something erroneous, or you've added something to it that the story didn't have, you've given the pro-life perspective that maybe was cut out, people are going to see that. Hundreds of thousands of people that read these stories will see, millions eventually, will see what you've commented on at the bottom. So get involved. Register. Go to the LA Times, go to the Washington Post, go to the New York Times, go to these places. CNN has them. A lot of Politico is a big popular political website that has them. Register and create an account and comment. Get involved in the debate and discussion. What you write there is going to be read by millions of people when it's all said and done. So get involved and do that. One thing I still suggest doing is contacting your local writers and reporters. A lot of people wonder if it makes any difference to actually contact the reporters themselves. The lower level you get when it comes to reporters and journalists, the better chance you have of making a difference. So for example, your local newspaper, I mean, somebody who works on CNN, Katie Couric, we're not going to really have a chance to impact her. But your local reporter, it's your local newspaper. A lot of times when you look at these stories now, and you go to your local newspaper, they're going to have next to the reporter's name, and they don't in this case. I'm sorry, there's not an example here. It doesn't look like it. This story is by Timothy Phelps of the Los Angeles Times. In a lot of cases, they're going to have their Twitter account, their Facebook page maybe, an email address, a way to contact them somehow. Maybe it goes to a form on a website that you can fill out. Use that. Contact those reporters. Let them know the truth. Tell them, hey, why didn't you include a pro-life person in this story? Why is this information not accurate? Why are you using these terms, for example, that are biased terms, that are favoring the pro-abortion side and not the pro-life side? Contact them. And like I said, the lower you get, when you get down to the state level, you get down to the local community level, those journalists are going to respond, because especially on the community level, they're going to be held accountable. That local newspaper wants to keep their readers. If there's a lot of complaints about the reporting, that might have an effect. Whereas the Los Angeles Times, if you contact them about the reporters, probably not a lot's going to happen. But your local newspaper, you might be able to make a difference. And the last thing, of course, is to boycott advertisers. Again, there's a lot more efficacy on the lower level. Boycotting people at the national level, it's very tough to do, very hard to get an organized boycott of somebody advertising on ABC or NBC or something. But at the local level, read your newspaper. If your newspaper is very biased when it comes to pro-life issues, contact them. If they're not printing your letters to the editor, if the bias continues even after you've consulted them and told them about it, start contacting advertisers and say, hey, especially if you know conservative or Christian business people in your community, maybe the local car dealership is owned by somebody who goes to your church. Contact him and say, hey, I see your full-page ad here in the newspaper. Well, this is a newspaper that won't report on anything we're doing. Or you've had the march and they leave out anything about your local march. Or they report on the bill at the State House and it's completely biased. Talk to that business person and say, hey, you're subsidizing this newspaper that's not presenting the truth to our community. Maybe you can have some effect. Maybe something can happen with that. So continue to work on those local levels, continue to contact people and make a difference. I wanted to leave time for questions and answers about the media and bias and what we can do, and I'm happy to take those. Sure. I like C-SPAN a lot. It's a great network. I think they were just focusing on the main networks, the network news, ABC, NBC, CBS, and then the main cable networks in the polls that I was referring to. So I don't think that's why they were included. One thing I encourage people to do is call in to C-SPAN. It's actually very easy. If you're watching C-SPAN, especially on any of the abortion votes going on in Congress, it's really not hard to get in and call in. They don't want people to repeat, so they really try to get people to not keep calling over and over, which opens those phone lines. Call in, and especially call in on the independent line, for example. If you're a Republican, try that out and give that a shot, but call in. It's very easy to get on there. I've been on there 3 or 4 times over the last couple of years when they've had things going on, and it's a great audience. I mean, you're reaching hundreds of thousands of people, and you get about 30 seconds to just talk, just make the case. So do that, call in and be a part of it. It's a great way to get the message out there, so definitely. Other people with questions right here. A news magazine, just a general news one. Yeah, I'll repeat the questions. The first question was about C-SPAN and why they weren't in the polls. I'm sorry if I didn't repeat that enough for that question. A news magazine, are you talking about just a general news magazine or one that's more politically focused or? A general? I would suggest World Magazine. It's a Christian magazine, and it is a .com. World Magazine. Now, obviously, this is more of a Protestant or evangelical magazine. The National Catholic Register is a wonderful Catholic newspaper. If you're Catholic and want to get that, they report on all sorts of things. They're very, very credible. But this is a credible Protestant Christian or evangelical Christian magazine. They have a website here, obviously, as you can see, but they do have a magazine that's very good. Human Events is another one that I would suggest that's very good as well. It is a little more political. World Mag tends to be just a little general and focused. Human Events is more of a conservative political magazine. It's very good. There's a whole lot of others. If you email me at news@lifenews.com, I can send you more. I just don't have time to go through every one that I can come up with here. But this is a good one as well. And then, of course, like I said, the National Catholic Register is just an excellent publication. I certainly recommend it to you. Their pro-life reporting is very good. They've interviewed me a couple of times, and the staff there are just very professional and do a great job. And so I heartily recommend it to you as well, for those of you who are Catholic.
It just won an award, too.
It just won an award. I'm not surprised. Their reporting is top shelf. What do I think of Sean Hannity? Fox News, and this is, I like Fox News. Sean Hannity is pro-life. He's done a number of speaking engagements at pro-life organizations, what have you. He's really good. One thing I want to caution you about Fox News, though, is this. It's not perfect. It's conservative. It's more amenable to the pro-life view. Sean Hannity always does a good job at getting pro-life guests on to talk about issues. Bill O'Reilly does a really good job of that, of getting pro-life guests on. And Bill O'Reilly, I like him because he'll pick up a lot of topics that a lot of others won't touch. Some of the more, partial birth abortion, just these hard-hitting. Lila Rose, he does a lot when they do the investigations, come out with the new videos. He's had her on many times, but they're not perfect. For example, I did a talk with Father Frank Pavone, a Priest for Life, last year, and he played a video about another unrelated issue, something that's not related to the media, but he played a Fox News video because he wanted to make a point about Terri Schiavo. And the point he was making, they were talking about her, and they were using terms, for example, this was a Fox News anchor saying that she was in a persistent vegetative state. Of course, we know that to be completely false. She was not in a PVS state. She was in a minimally conscious state, which is very, very different when you look medically and even legally at those terms. And PVS state, that implies that, she's a vegetable, her life is not worth living. It's a very derogatory, a very negative way of presenting her condition. And so Father Frank and I talked about that after his presentation, and I said, boy, I love Fox News, but did you catch the term they used? They said Terri was in a PVS state. He said, yeah. He said, I showed the video for other reasons to make a point on something else, but that was certainly something that he caught as well, that they're not perfect. So I read you those numbers. Republicans, conservatives tend to trust Fox News for good reason. But again, be careful, when you're watching. Have the filter that, hey, if you see something that kind of raises a red flag and you maybe wonder about, go back and do the research and look it up and see if they're really presenting it right, and call them on it. They're not going to be perfect either. So Twitter, I don't know how many of you are on Twitter. We talked about that at another workshop. Twitter is a great way to reach journalists, reporters, people in the media, because you can talk to, frankly, Sean Hannity has a Twitter account. You can send him a message. Now, it may be lost in a lot of others, but especially, again, the lower you get in the level and you get away from the big national people, you can reach out to a lot of people, your local newspaper reporters, for example, on Twitter. Contact them and say, hey, I saw something, it wasn't right, here's the truth, what have you. So Twitter is a good way to do that. If you're not on there, I certainly suggest it. Back in the back, there was a question, and then right here. The question was, for those of you who didn't hear it, Mike Huckabee, who, as you know, has had a Fox News television program for a while, has recently started a radio program I love Mike Huckabee. I had the privilege actually in college in the early 90s working on his very first campaign. I went to college in Arkansas, and his first campaign for lieutenant governor, I had the privilege of working as a volunteer on that campaign. He's a great guy. I mean, he's a wonderful pro-lifer. He's always been very articulately pro-life, never compromised. He's as solid as a rock pro-lifer, and certainly encourage you to listen to his show if you have time to do that. He's a great guy, and I understand a lot of why he didn't run this time, and that's another topic that's not really for this workshop. But a good person would have been a good president if he were the nominee and would have been elected. But certainly commend him to you. Absolutely, right here. It's a great comment. If you didn't hear it, just really diversify where you get your news from. Don't rely on any single source. Really go out there and look for it, and rely on what organizations are sending you, because frankly, Oregon Right to Life, National Right to Life, Life News, other pro-life groups that are out there, I've named some others, Priests for Life, Susan B. Anthony List, other groups that are sending out information are really going to give you the whole story. They're going to give you everything. So really rely on that, and I just can't commend those to you enough, definitely. Somebody right here had their hand up. And a lot of people don't realize that Andrew Breitbart was very pro-life. In fact, it actually was recently that he came out and talked at length about his pro-life views and adoption and things like that very eloquently. And if you look on YouTube and do a search on him, we actually, in fact, at Life News we have that. I'm going to show that to you real quick. Not the video, but just at least the article so you can look it up. His websites, frankly, are one of the reasons why the work that Lila Rose has done has gotten so much play. He really was the main person pushing those initial videos that Lila had done exposing Planned Parenthood and what was going on at Planned Parenthood. Andrew Breitbart and his websites were just wonderful. I met him a couple of times. He wouldn't have known me personally. I just met him at events and what have you. But he was just very instrumental. A lot of you, if you don't know his background, he was a conservative blogger. He was a conservative media icon. He actually worked with Matt Drudge at the Drudge Report before going off on his own and creating his own conservative media empire. I want to see if you go to Life News and just do a search on his name. We've got some video of him talking about his pro-life views, and certainly recommend that to you. He really was solid, especially at the end. The last couple of years, he really, just a light bulb kind of came on. And especially with Lila and what she was doing, he really promoted that. He wanted to get it out there. He wanted people to wake up to what was going on. So he was definitely a friend of the pro-life cause, for sure. And he is greatly missed by those of us that are kind of on the right side of the media circles. A lot of people that I work with very closely knew him very, very well, more so than I did, and miss him greatly. Question here. I do know about this survey. I'm not recalling the information from it right now, but I want to recommend this website to you. I don't know why Google is giving an error, but it's Newsbusters. Newsbusters is a great website. A lot of the information that I share with you comes from Newsbusters because they are the media watchdogs for us on the pro-life side of the abortion debate. It's Brent Bozell's group. You probably know him. He's been a pro-life and conservative activist for many, many years. And so the Media Research Center is the sponsor of this website, but newsbusters.org, O-R-G, newsbusters.org, or just look up Newsbusters in Google or something like that. They are monitoring the media, and they watch what's going on, and you can scroll down, you can see they're covering the Washington Post, and people using profanity and political fact-checking websites that are wrong, like PolitiFact and Fact Check. Geraldo Rivera, MSNBC, ABC News, you can see they're covering all sorts of topics, not just pro-life, it's all political topics. But go there and you can get great examples of liberal bias from them and show your friends and family to say, hey, here's what we've uncovered. They do a lot of studies, they do a lot of research. I talked to you about the one researcher, Rich Noyes, who is a good pro-lifer. I don't know anybody in Newsbusters who's not pro-life. They're all solid pro-life advocates. And they've done a lot of research, for example, on abortion. That I cited to you earlier about those percentage of stories in terms of, we weren't getting represented and whatnot. Newsbusters, they're behind all that, so definitely recommend them. I think we're getting close to the time. Oh, we hit it?
Maybe one
That's an excellent question. The question, for those of you who didn't hear it, if I was teaching a public or a high school class, I wouldn't be teaching in the public schools because they probably wouldn't have me. But if I were teaching a high school or college class, how would I get people to substantiate information correctly? Is a great question. The first thing I would do is suggest to them not to use a lot of internet websites. There's so much junk out there. It is unbelievable the number of students who, and I'm not a teacher, so I only know this anecdotally, who are turning in papers that are completely off the internet. They didn't write a single word, or they're citing it with, for example, Wikipedia, which is found to be, it's good, it has useful information, but there are lots of errors in Wikipedia. So the first thing I would do is suggest that they not entirely use the internet, that they go to other sources than internet websites. I would suggest that they use reputable places, and as much as we harp on the bias in the media, they need to actually go to original sources, and maybe that is, even though it's incorrect, maybe that is a Washington Times story or New York Post story or whatever the case might be. To go to those and find the original source. In the blogosphere that we have now, there's a lot of secondary stuff. So you're seeing information that may be wrong that gets blogged, that gets repeated, and you see a lot of bloggers, and it may be a little hypocritical because I do some blogging to call us out on that, but a lot of bloggers are wrong. And so what I would say is go to the primary source. Who uncovered the information initially? And so don't cite the secondary blog or somebody, oh, by the way, somebody else reported somebody who said somebody who did this. Go to the original source. And granted, it may be a liberal mainstream media news outlet that did the original reporting, the original fact-checking, and what have you. But go to the source. Don't trust the secondary internet stuff. There's so much of that going on now where it's second and third and fourth hand. You lose a lot of the information. So definitely, that's what I would suggest to do, is go to where whoever uncovered it. They did the work. They did the legwork to either interview somebody who's made a comment, if that's what we're talking about, or they're on the ground checking the facts. Go to the source. Go to where it's at, is what I would suggest. I hope that helped. Thanks for being here. If you have any other questions, I'm happy to talk to you down here. So take care.